Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight with guest speaker, highly acclaimed author and political commentator, David Brooks. Before we get started, I'd just like to note that David is going to give us a presentation of about 45 minutes. And after that time, there will be time for Q&A, about 30 minutes. And the way that will be done is Assistant Director of the Institute, Greg Seams, will be up here with a mic, and he'll be holding the mic, and people will line up to pose their questions. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm Professor of Religion and Philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute that is sponsoring our event tonight. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and encourage free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive, civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing this event tonight, special thanks go to Shannon Regier, Greg Seams, Molly Work, Carrie Vanderveen, Katie Warren, Aida Mejia, Michael Kyle, Megan Nelson, Enoch Blazes, and Jeff O'Donnell. Thanks very much for their hard work, their diligence, their dedication to the Institute and to the college. Our event tonight inaugurates the Institute's speaker series for fall 2018 on the theme of patriotism, nationalism, and the idea of America. As I've said in earlier notices of the Institute's fall program, Donald Trump's presidential campaign and presidency have urged in various moments a revival of American patriotism and nationalism. His clarion call has been America first. And this attitude is indicated in a range of policies and proposals related to immigration, trade, international security, and other matters. Donald Trump's election and presidency concur with other revivals of nationalistic spirit worldwide and prompt thoughtful Americans to consider carefully the idea of America, the role of the United States in the international community, and the obligations of American citizens to other citizens and to humanity at large. Few are as well positioned as our guest speaker to keynote the Institute's fall program with this theme. Widely regarded as one of the most engaging, insightful, and nuanced political commentators of our time, David Brooks is a columnist for the New York Times, a regular political analyst on the PBS NewsHour and NPR's All Things Considered, and the author of a number of rich and important books, the most recent being The Road to Character, published in 2015. He worked at the Wall Street Journal for 9 years and has written for The New Yorker, Forbes, The Washington Post, and many other periodicals. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he teaches at Yale University. Some of his many other accomplishments are listed in the program that we have made available for the event tonight. In his writing and commentary, David Brooks has often reflected on the meaning of America. In moments, he has advocated what I would call a chastened nationalism, one that celebrates the virtues of America, but also worries about new forms of American tribalism, both domestic and international. He commends an American patriotism that prizes national unity, but appreciates diversity within the nation and in the larger world. He articulates a vision of the American dream that, and I quote his own words, says no to tribe and yes to the open future, no to the fear-driven homogeneity of the old continent, and yes to the diverse hopefulness of the new one. Brooks's proposals here are controversial, but they are civilly expressed, and they invite civil conversation and debate. In that spirit of civility, will you please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, David Brooks.
Thank you. They asked me to speak about patriotism, nationalism, but I thought they meant Norwegian patriotism, but I'll switch over and do that one. It's great to be back here in Minnesota. I'm a frequent visitor here, not to campus. This is my first time to campus, but I'm in the Twin Cities all the time. I spent a lot of time around Minnesota politicians for some reason. When I got my current job at the New York Times, I was given a good piece of advice, which is to interview 3 politicians every day, which I spent a lot of time doing. I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call emotional logorrhea dementia, which is talking so much they drive themselves insane. But I, for some reason, fell in with the Minnesota Mafia. Knew Orville and Connie Freeman back in the day, Don Frazier, if you remember that. I got to know Dave Dernberger, who's still up at St. Thomas early in my life. He told me, become a moderate Republican, that's the future. So that worked. And I'm a big admirer and fan of Walter Mondale, of course, and a childhood hero of mine. On my wall in my bedroom was a poster of Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign. And the slogan on top was, some do change, some only talk change. And so early on, I realized I only wanted to talk change. I didn't want to do change. And now one of my favorite senators is Amy Klobuchar. And I've told this story so many times, I'm really not sure if it's true. But I was flying back from the Twin Cities to D.C., and I was bumped up to first class, and she was also bumped up to first class. And the story is to illustrate that some senators, you're a little afraid of them, but with Klobuchar, she's like a normal human being. And so because she's a senator, we were sitting like in 2A and B, and she went back to work the room, back in the back of the plane to shake hands, meet people. And then she came up back into the first class cabin, and the flight attendant said, I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not allowed to come back up here. And she looked at me pleadingly, and I said, I've never seen this woman before in my life. I don't know. And so she represents, like, usually senators, they have somewhat ego. Someone said they don't have heads, they have containers for heads, but she is one of just a normal, good human being. So I will talk about patriotism and American nationalism and really the state of society. But I want to do it from a somewhat deeper level than I normally do. I'm at a college, and people know me as a somewhat bookish, somewhat overly cognitive person. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and I realized at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I remember in high school I wanted to date some woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that was the cerebral start to my life. The admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And as you know about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. It's my favorite saying. And so it is a bookish school, and I was a bookish person there. I double majored in history and celibacy while I was there. And I actually I became a boxing manager there. I had a friend he was the kosher killer, but we didn't actually just learn boxing, we just read books about boxing. And then he entered the Chicago Golden Gloves, and because of a bunch of injuries, he got a bye all the way up to the semifinals. So he comes out swinging, and his arms are over his head because he's never boxed in his life. The other boxer shoots back into the corner, and realizes 92 seconds in, well, this guy has his head down. One uppercut ends this fight, which is what happened. But that was our Chicago way of conquering the world. And it was bookish. And then I got a job, even on TV, it was a bookish show that I'm on a show called The News Hour with a guy named Mark Shields. We have a segment called Shields and Brooks. We should have called it Brooke Shields, it would have been better. And it is, I think, a more civil and cerebral kind of show compared to the other TV shows. We have a certain demographic. If a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. We're very big in the hospice community, and so even that's bookish. And then I got the job writing a column for the New York Times. I'm the conservative columnist of the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being chief rabbi in Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And so that's all just writing and reading books. And as you get older, your tastes get a little more feminine, I think a little more sensitive. And so I'm the only American man who finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love, if you've ever read that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal. And my friends joke that me writing a book about emotion was like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not the natural thing because I'm not unnaturally emotional. And then most recently I wrote a book about character, or a book called The Road to Character. And I learned writing that book that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I recommend that. So all this is to say, I'm here at a college campus. It's a bookish place. I'm a bookish person. And yet I do think that our cognitive rational brain is the third most important part of our consciousness. And that the first is the desiring heart. I read a story about a guy not long ago who bought a house and there was a bamboo stand growing by the driveway in the front yard. And he didn't like bamboo, and so he chopped it down. He took an axe to the root system. He dumped a bunch of plant poison. He covered the hole over with 3 foot of gravel and 6 inches of cement. And 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo coming up through the cement. And I think we have that in ourselves, which is our desire. St. Augustine had it right. We're not primarily cognitive creatures. We're primarily desiring creatures. You become what you love. There were orphanages in Nevada where they took kids who were 2.5 years old, or 0 to 2.5, and they wanted to give them nutrition, and they wanted to give them health care, but they did not want to touch them because they didn't want to get germs. This is back in the 40s. And the kids had a 38% mortality rate because it's physical touch and affection that literally wires the fibers of the brain together. The Grant study, this great longitudinal study done at Harvard, found that men who had no love in their homes as children were 3 times more likely to suffer from mental illness, 2.5 times more likely to suffer from dementia, and they made 50% less money over the course of their careers. So it is the nature of how much love is poured into us that determines how we do in life, and what our heart primarily wants is fusion with another person, is intimate connection, the kind of connection that Louis de Bernier described in his book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In that book, there's an old guy talking to his daughter about his late wife. And he says to her, "Love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two." I think that's what we want, to fuse with one another. The second most important quality is the yearning soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. That's really not my department. But I do ask you to believe that there's a piece of you that has no shape, size, or color or weight, but is of infinite value and dignity. That rich and successful people don't have more of this than poor or less successful older people, not more than younger people. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another human being's soul. That rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, but it's an obliteration of another person's soul. And so obscenity is anything that covers over another's soul. And what the soul mostly does is it yearns for righteousness. It yearns for goodness. I've covered crimes, I've covered wars, and I've met people who've committed genocide and killed hundreds of thousands of people. I've never met anybody who didn't secretly want to be good. Prisoners want to be good. If we feel that our life is not good and meaningful, our life has a tendency to fall apart. And so what Plato said, what we do when we're educated, is we naturally climb a ladder of loves. Plato said, if you want to educate the young, show them a beautiful face. And they'll see the beautiful face is a beautiful thing, but there's a higher beauty, which is a beautiful personality. And when they see the higher beauty of a personality, they'll see there's a higher beauty than that, which is a beautiful society, which is justice. And when they see the beauty of that, they'll realize there's even higher beauty, which is truth and the search for truth. And when they see that, they'll see there's the highest beauty from which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken, which is the beauty of the whole universe. And we all have that yearning to have higher loves. And the highest thing the soul longs for, I think, is to be connected and pursuing some ideal, often in connection with one other people. And so there's a passage from Rabbi Wolf Kellman, who marched in Selma with Martin Luther King, and he describes what it was like to march across the bridge with King. He said, "We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment." And so to me, everything I say follows from this seeing human beings not just as cognitive heads, but as hearts and as souls. And one of the things hearts and souls do, and minds, and one of the things we do collectively is we create cultures, we create norms. And a culture is a collective enterprise to solve the problems of the day. And I'd like to walk us through three cultures up to where we are, three cultural moments. And the first is the culture between 1932 and 1968. That was a generation that had to face some big problems, the Depression, the World Wars, and they built a moral culture organized around big institutions and collectivity. They built a culture around a phrase that you might say, we're all in this together. It was a very communal culture. If you grew up on the Chicago South Side, you probably went to a big employer, the Army, labor unions, IBM. If you grew up in a certain neighborhood, you probably went to the Nabisco plant where your father and your grandfather worked. You probably joined the same big union. If you lived in a neighborhood there, and here too, in the Twin Cities, you were part of a tight community. If somebody asked you, where are you from, you didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski, because the tight neighborhood defined your people. And there were babysitting cooperatives, there were coffee clutches, there were barbecues. It took an enormous amount of effort to be a loner in that community. There was no TV and no air conditioning, so people were running into each other's houses, the kids, and they had a really tight community. If you went into politics like much else, you didn't do it as an individual, you did it as part of an organization. In Chicago, of course, it was Boss Daley's machine. You worked for the machine. There was a guy named John Ferry who joined the machine. Boss Daley sent him to Springfield, to the Illinois State Legislature, where he served for 20 years. And then at the end, Boss Daley said, I'll reward him. I'll send him to the U.S. Congress in Washington just so I can say he was a congressman. And the reporters asked Ferry, how are you going to vote when you get to Washington? And Ferry replied, I will go to Washington to help represent Mayor Daley. For 21 years, I represented the mayor in the legislature, and he was always right. And so that's deference to authority. And this culture had a lot of good things. Sense of modesty, sense of community, sense of humility, and a very clear awareness of what the American story was, a coherent view of the nation. In the 1950s, there was a series of historians called the consensus historians, and they saw America as this great covenantal project. European Puritans came to our shores in the 17th century, and they saw massive abundance in front of them. So they saw flocks of geese so big it took them 45 minutes to turn off. to take off. They would actually shoot cannons into the flocks of geese just to see if they could alter their direction. And two thoughts came to them. One, that God's plans for humanity could be completed on this continent, and two, they could get really rich in the process. And so this was a country of moral materialism. And this was a country, an eschatological country, a country where the future was always more important than the present. Because it was a country being created. It was an Exodus story. It was people who'd left the old world, the tyranny, had crossed the wilderness, and were coming to build the promised land. The settlers would go west, and they'd pass by perfectly good farmland in Ohio because they were convinced something even better was further down the road. There's a novel I'm sure you all know called Giants of the Earth, set not too far from here. And if you remember this novel, there's a scene where the farmer's taking around a visitor to his farm, and he says, "This is our farmland, this is where the pastures are going to be, this is everything." And the visitor says, "I don't see any barns or anything." And the host says, "Well, we haven't built it yet." But he's seeing the present from the vantage point of the future. And that was a classically American thing. And the Puritans came up with the idea that we are an Exodus country. The founders, Ben Franklin, wanted to put Moses on the Great Seal of the United States because we are an Exodus country. My immigrant ancestors came here seeing this as an Exodus country. Martin Luther King spoke of the Exodus more than he spoke of the New Testament. And that was the story of America, a covenantal nation, the last best hope of earth. And there was a great national consensus about that. There were weaknesses to that culture, too. Some of the weaknesses were racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, emotional coldness, really boring food. And so people decided to chop up that culture. People felt oppressed. It was too conformist, too organization, man. They couldn't express themselves. In 1962, a bunch of young people got together in Michigan and created the Port Huron Statement, which says, "I want to be free to be myself. I'm sick of this tight community. We have too much community in this country." And so there was a cultural shift. The shift is symbolized to me in a great event of my childhood, which was Super Bowl III. In 1969 or 70, two quarterbacks faced each other in the Super Bowl where the Baltimore Colts played the New York Jets. And they both grew up within about 5 or 10 miles of each other in western Pennsylvania, but 10 years apart. One of them was a guy named Johnny Unitas, typical 1950s guy, crew cut, high-top shoes, played football like a plumber, a really good player, but just workmanlike and boring. On my side of the field, the New York Jets, was a guy named Joe Namath. He had long hair, $5,000 fur coats, posed for pantyhose ads. He was a big swinger. He wrote a memoir called "I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day." And Johnny Unitas would not have written that memoir. And so there was a shift in culture. Suddenly it was cool to be young, not old, expressive, not reticent, casual, not formal, a rebel, not a conformist, and individual and not institutional. The idea was liberation. Liberation from the bonds of religion, liberation from the bonds of class, liberated to sexually express yourself as you wanted, liberated by technology. And it was about individual liberation, and it brought us a lot of great things. When cultures shift, there's usually a reason. Cultures shift by a habit one social theorist called the ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet process. The culture has a problem, so they create a new culture, and you ratchet upwards, you solve it. After a while, it runs out of steam, it becomes more obsolete, and so people hatchet it up. And so, but human ingenuity is important, so people pivot over. And then they solve the problem again, and they ratchet up again. And so we move upwards this way. And so we got the civil rights movement out of this shift in culture. We got feminism out of this shift in culture. We got rock and roll out of this shift in culture. I don't think we could have had the creative individualism of Silicon Valley, that rebel culture, if we hadn't shifted to a more individualistic culture. So it worked for a while. It also, over time, produced some bad things. First, a rise in narcissism, the essence that the answer to all your problems are inside yourself. Be true to yourself. You do your own thing. So there's a thing called the narcissism test where they ask people, I'm going to read you a bunch of statements, does it apply to you? And they're statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Or somebody should write a book about me. I like to look at my body. The media's narcissism score has risen 30% in the last 20 years. There's a study done, and with that has gone a desire for fame. There's a study done where they asked people, would you like to be president of Harvard or a celebrity's personal assistant, Justin Bieber's personal assistant? And by 3-1, people would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant than president of Harvard. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. And so we've had a run of about 60 years of individualism. And it's had some, when you take any true idea and pursue it to its extreme, it becomes false. And we've taken individualism and pushed it pretty far. And the first bad result is isolation. In 1980, 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely. Now twice as many do. 35% of people over 45 are chronically lonely. In 1970, married couples entertained their friends on average of 15 times a year. Now it's only 8 times a year. Only 8% of Americans report having significant conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. 9 million men have dropped out of the labor force. Suicide rates have been rising since 1999. One of your former guests, Jonathan Haidt, told me the other day that over the last 15 or 20 years, teenage male suicide rates have gone up 25%, and teenage female suicide rates have gone up 70%. And suicide is a proxy for loneliness. 45,000 people die of suicide every year, 55,000 people die of opiate addiction every year, and opiate addiction is just slow motion suicide. The second is an institutional crisis, a crisis of trust. If you asked people back in that we're all in this together era, do you trust the institutions of your society? 80% said yes. Now it's down to about 20%. Massive decline in trust in our institutions. If you asked people in that era, do you trust the people around you are trustworthy? About 60% said, yeah, my neighbors are trustworthy. Now if you ask that question, 32% say yes, including 19% of millennials. Trust in institutions went away all at once in Vietnam and Watergate. Trust in each other has been going down steadily over the last few decades, so the younger you get, the more distrustful you are. And as Robert Putnam of Harvard said, it's not perception, it's reality. People are less trusting because people are less trustworthy. The third crisis is the crisis of amputation. We divide ourselves, in our meritocracy, we treat ourselves as brains and talents and human resources to be harvested, not as souls to be realized. Our schools often treat our students as brains on a stick and ignore the rest. And when you amputate that part of reality, you leave a lot of people who are good at figuring out what to do, but not good at finding what to do or why they're doing it. And that leads to the fourth crisis, which is a crisis of meaning, a crisis of purpose and telos. It's amazing to me that mental health problems are rising, not falling, that depression rates are rising, not falling. I see it in my students. They graduate from school, they hit a crisis at 25, which is bound to happen, and they crater. And why does that happen? Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you don't know why you're living, then when the hard times come, you crater. And so these 3 or 4 crises have produced a further crisis. Psychologists say the hardest thing to cure is the patient's attempt to self-cure. And when you leave people naked and alone, which the 60 years of individualism has done, it's left us naked and alone, people do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. And that's essentially what's happened over the last 15 years to our politics. We have what we call negative polarization. Do you like your own party? Not particularly. Do you hate the other party? Totally. And so what we have is a tribal mentality. Now, tribalism is community for narcissists. Tribalism is not built on mutual affection, it's built on mutual distrust. And so it's a certain sort of mentality. It's us versus them, friend-enemy distinction, life is conflict, politics is war, society is tribal, build walls, erect barriers, believe conspiracies, make accusations. I spent some time not long ago with Steve Bannon, and I found it fascinating. It was like being with Trotsky in 1905. And he has like a 100-year plan. He doesn't believe in diversity. He thinks Donald Trump is only a piece of his plan. He's going to take over this institution, that institution. He's either crazy or genius. I don't know. I'm hoping the first one, but I don't know. But he does understand that this kind of tribalism is on the march. He's got a set of international allies, and he does understand the current moment. We're in one of those hatchet moments, like 1848, 1905, 1932, 1968. And if you had to bet which way society would go right now, you'd say once we're in a culture that says we're all in this together. Then we shifted into a culture that says I'm free to be myself, the individualistic culture. And based on current trends, you'd have to say that our coming future is revert to tribe. I was a foreign correspondent in the 1950s. I wasn't born then, believe me. In the 1990s. And I covered a lot of good news. I covered the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, reunification of Germany, Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa, the Oslo peace process. It was nothing but good news, people coming together, the triumph of the liberal democratic order. The last thing I covered was the Yugoslav Civil War. I didn't really pay much attention to it because it seemed so small compared to everything else I covered. In retrospect, that was the most important event I covered, because the last 25 years have been the rise of ethnic nationalism, the rise of tribalism, the rise of strongman politics all around the world. And the society is figuring out how do we find a new equilibrium where we can actually believe in each other and reverting to nationalism. And so to me, we're at one of these pivot points in history. When George H.W. Bush crossed the Yale campus in 1941, he heard about Pearl Harbor and he walked across to the recruiting station and enlisted. He had a sense of faith in America. Today, we don't have anything as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but when 55,000 people die every year of opioids, that seems to me a silent Pearl Harbor. When classes fight each other and grow further apart, that seems like a silent Pearl Harbor. When 45,000 people kill themselves every year, it seems like a silent Pearl Harbor. And it seems like a moment to do something more than what we normally do, like this institute, to create a sense of cohesion and national purpose. And what's been lost in the atomization of our society is a sense of a national story. I go around to the college where I teach and other colleges, and I ask young people about the national story. I tell them my story. I tell them the story my grandfather told to me, this Exodus story. We won the lottery of life to be born here because this is the greatest nation in history of the earth. And in my generation, about 70% believe that America is the greatest land on earth. Among the current college student generation, 22% believe that. And so there's been this radical decline. And that's in part because I tell them this story of Exodus. We left oppression, crossed the wilderness, came to build the promised land, and they look at me and they say, "You are crazy. That's the story rich white men tell." And there's some truth to what they're saying. And they just don't believe my story. And they don't believe the inherited story. It just doesn't seem real to them. And at some point you have to respect that that's what they believe. I think the educational system, whoever decided we should stop teaching American history in high schools, did a very effective job. But it's still, you have to accept the fact, okay, so what story can we tell together? What is our new story that we can all believe in? So I've spent a lot of time studying when do societies turn around? How do you take a society that's spinning out of control in an individualistic way? How do they come back together? And there are two examples of this in history. I used to say, well, it would really help, war is the classic case where countries come back together. And I used to say, well, it would be nice if we got invaded by Canada, but now that might actually happen, so I don't say that anymore. It's happened twice, in my knowledge. I only know a small part of the world. It happened in England between 1810 and 1848, and it happened in this country between 1890 and 1910. In 1890, in this country, we had a big economic transition to industrialization. We had a wave of immigration. We had political corruption. We had a lot of the same problems. And what happened? First, there was a religious revival. The social gospel movement, which was very collective, replaced the social Darwinist movement, which was very individualistic. Second, we had a civic revival. Within 5 years, a whole burst of institutions came into being to bind the communities together. The Boys and Girl Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the NAACP, the labor unions, the settlement house movement, the environmental movement, the temperance movement. They all bound communities together. And then eventually, after those two things happened, there was a political movement, the progressives. And America really did recover. It came back together. And we had the American century, the 20th century. Today, I don't know if we're seeing a religious revival. I live 10 blocks from the US Capitol. I guarantee you we're not seeing a political revival. But I do think we are seeing a civic revival. There's a sentence at the end of one of Walker Percy's novels. There's only one thing I can do: listen to people, see how they stick themselves into the world, and hand them along. And that sentence, that see how they stick themselves into the world, that was frankly something people in the individualistic era were not good at. Planting themselves down, sticking themselves into the world. So they're committed and planted and settled. My wife and I travel around the country, and what we find everywhere we go is people who have stuck themselves down. We're part of a community in DC called AOK. It's a couple who just live in a home in DC. They had a kid who went to the public schools, and he had a friend named James who didn't have a place to really live and eat. His mom had some health and other issues. So they said, James can stay with us. And then that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And when I first went to their house about 4 or 5 years ago, there were 15 or 20 mattresses on the floor. When we went to their home at Thursday night, there were 26 kids around the table. I walk in there. I'm a reticent, I might as well have been born in the Midwest. I'm not a real physical, huggy guy kind of guy. I walk in to shake one of the kids' hands. He says, we don't shake hands here, we hug here. And so every Thursday night we gather, we go around the table, we say what we're grateful for, we say what we're worried about. Kids talk about their depression, their health issues, their victories. And it is as tight a community as you can possibly imagine. I brought my daughter there, and she said, that's the warmest place I've ever been. We brought a friend named Bill Milliken, who's been doing youth work for 50 years. He said, people often ask him, what programs turn around lives? He said, I've been doing this all this time. I've never seen a program turn around a life. It's only relationships that turn around lives. And they're reknitting an extended family at that home. There's a woman we know named Sarah Heminger, who she was from the Midwest. When she was a kid, her dad reported on the church pastor for embezzling money. Instead of getting rid of the pastor, they ostracized her whole family. So she spent 8 years ostracized as a kid, alone. She went to Johns Hopkins. She noticed a lot of kids on the streets of Baltimore who were ostracized and alone. She created an organization called Thread, where they take the lowest performing kids in Baltimore schools, and they have 4 volunteers who are really their parents, then 4 more who are their grandparents, then a circle more to help them. So each kid is suddenly surrounded by a web of relationships, and these people are surrounded with each other. Whenever the kids meet a volunteer, their phones get next to each other, and that contact point gets recorded on her app, which she calls the Fitbit of social relationships. She can tell when there's been a touch, when there's been 3 hours between a touch. She's created a community. So what these two organizations are doing is taking the excesses of the age of individualism, the way we're isolated from one another, and they're rebuilding community at the bottom level, at the heart and the soul level. And in my view, Before we can have civil conversations with each other, we've got to have some level of trust down at the foundations. I hang around politicians all day, and they do not understand the kind of problem we have. Some decades are defined by a foreign invasion, some by a financial crisis. In other words, they're problems of the market or they're problems of the state. But those two institutions rest on a nest, a more fundamental level of substrate. And that substrate is human relationship, social trust, basic decency to one another. And our problems these days are down in the foundation. And people have to deal with the problems down at the foundations, not at the level of law, not at the level of market, and frankly, not at the national level. There's a phrase in the book of Job, and the sparks fly upward. And that's how the solution is going to have to come, at the local level, community by community, as the sparks fly upward. And the problem with relationships is that they don't scale. Relationships are built slowly every day, one by one. But you have enough of these people around the country, what they're doing is they're creating a new culture. Not a culture of individualism that says it's all about me. Not a culture of collectivism where the individual is lost in the collective, but a culture of personalism. A culture that says each individual human being is a person of infinite depth. But when you get down to that deep level of each person, what you find is a longing for relationship. A longing for relationship with each other, and a longing with the relationship with the good. And that is the heart and soul. And so what I find in these people, these community builders all around the country, is a desire to go deep into themselves and to go deeply vulnerable with each other. They have a whole culture which is just trying to come into being. They are morally motivated. They are not primarily interested by money, status, and power. They want connection. They want to feel right with the world. They're deeply relational. They want to get intimate with each other. They've invented technologies of intimacy to get intimate with each other. There is an organization called Becoming a Man in Chicago where they take gang members on the West Side, they bring them into a thing called the checkup, and each kid has to check in and say how they're doing spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. And if the kid is not completely open, the other gang members get all over him. Remember, these are kids who are gang members, they're armored up. But they have to have intimacy. There's radical mutuality. There's a complete rejection of the idea that some of us are haves and some are have-nots. The ethos here is we're all broken, we're all walking this together. There's vocational certitude. I've met thousands of these people now building community all around the country, and the one thing they all say without exception is, I'm going to die doing this. They have no doubts that this is why they were put on this earth, to build this community. And to me, we spend all our time debating Trump, whether you like Trump or not, but to me that's not where the action is. The action is happening on the local level, all around the culture. A new sort of ethos is being built, a renegotiation of power, a knitting together of institutions, a creating of thick institutions. Some institutions are thick and some are thin. Some you work at a place, you go to college, and you sort of pass through and you don't know. They don't really affect you. You went to the college, you needed a degree, you got out of it, fine, you got your degree. But some institutions are really thick. They transform who you are. If you're a Marine, a Morehouse man, a Juilliard pianist, and these thick institutions have a clear purpose. They know why they're there, what exactly transformation they're trying to do. They have a cramped physical location. They involve face-to-face communication, usually over a dinner table. There's always music involved, because if you've danced with somebody, it's hard to stay distant from them. There's a sacred origin story, a moment when they nearly failed. They often have overnights so they can see each other after dinner and before they have breakfast, before they put on their makeup. There's a sacred guidebook, an object passed along. My college was a thick institution. It changed me forever. I go to a lot of colleges that are thick institutions. Sewanee University, Kenyon College. I think this is a thick institution. They change whoever you are because they're not afraid to be themselves, to stand out. And when I look at these community builders, I see them not as people only reweaving the fabric of society. I see them creating a cultural revolution. Cultures change when people on the margins of society find a superior way to live and other people want to follow them. And when I see these people working in these local organizations, they've got a better way to live. And they point to a new American story. It's not the Exodus story. It's not building the promised land. It's a redemption story. It's a story that we are part of a great experiment. It's still a very young experiment. We've screwed it up big time, but it can come back. The great piece of literature of the redemption narrative is Lincoln's second inaugural. When he delivered it, he knew the North was going to win the Civil War. So it could have been a moment of triumph. We were right, you were wrong, we won, you lost. It was the exact opposite. The key words in that story are us, all, and our. They're collective words. He didn't say slavery was a Southern institution. He said it's an American institution, and the wages of this sin correctly fall on all of us. And so it's a great rebinding around a story of a failure and redemption. And so to me, what interests me about these community builders and about that kind of story, it's a fusion story. It's about transcendence. It's about when one person comes together with somebody completely opposite and they fuse. In this age of individualism, we spend a lot of time talking about happiness. We've got happiness research, happiness books. When we use the word happiness, it seems to me we're actually talking about two different things. The first is individual happiness. And that kind of individual happiness flows out of a personal enlargement. You feel happy when you win some victory, you get a promotion, you graduate, you make progress toward your goals, your team wins a football game. And that's the enlargement of self. But there's a different kind of happiness, which is about the erasure of self. It's when you fall into and fuse with another person. And when you think about that kind of happiness, we don't really call it happiness, we call it joy. And joy is different than happiness, and I think we all understand that. I think we all understand that joy is better than happiness because it involves something emotional where you're fusing with another person, and something spiritual. There's something spiritual about joy. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about joy and collecting examples and descriptions of joy. And they're like different levels of it. There's like spiritual joy or physical joy. I was talking to some of the students today, and I mentioned to them this quote from the novelist Zadie Smith. And she has a good description of what physical joy, what collective effervescence feels like. She's in London in 1999, and she's at a nightclub. She's lost her friends. She's looking for a handbag when suddenly the hip-hop artist Q-Tip can be heard rapping over the sound system. And she writes, "A real thin man with enormous eyes reached across a sea of bodies for my hand. He kept asking me the same thing over and over. You feelin' it?" I was. My ridiculous heels were killing me. I was terrified I might die, yet I felt simultaneously overwhelmed with delight that Can I Kick It should happen to be playing in this moment of history on this sound system, and was now morphing into Smells Like Teen Spirit. I took the man's hand, the top of my head flew away. We danced and danced, we gave ourselves over to joy. That's losing yourself in the moment. The second is what you might call emotional joy, the kind of joy you feel when your heart is really bonded with another person. One of my favorite descriptions of that is from a heroine of mine named Dorothy Day. She was about to give birth when she realized that all the accounts of births she'd ever read were written by guys. So 40 minutes after literally giving birth, she sat down and wrote a beautiful essay of what it felt like. And a lot of it is violent, the pain of it. This was back in the 1920s or so. But then her essay finishes with this passage. If I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I felt after the birth of my child. With this came a need to worship and to adore. transcendent moment of fusion with her new daughter. Another layer is what you might call spiritual joy, connection with the natural world, the transcendent order. I have a friend who's a poet named Chris Wyman, and Chris is the kind of guy who, in his early adulthood, he lived in a lot of places, a lot of odd places. And you ask him, why do you live in Buffalo? He'd say, well, there's a girl there. And then you say, well, why'd you live in Prague? Oh, there was a girl there. And so he just chased girls around through his 20s. Not a bad way to spend your 20s. But he was in Prague one day, and he was working on his poetry on the kitchen table. And suddenly a falcon landed on the windowsill. And he was transfixed by this falcon. It was just like 3 feet from him. Didn't notice him yet. He was just scanning the street. And Wyman called into his girlfriend, come here, and she was in the shower. So she runs out dripping wet and naked. And they stare, looking at this bird. And then the bird turns his head and locks eyes with Wyman. And they're all just frozen. And his girlfriend says, wish for something. Like, take advantage of this moment. And Wyman later wrote a poem about it, which includes this stanza. And for a long moment I'm still in. I wished and I wished and I wished that the moment would not end. And just like that, it vanished. And sometimes the difference about joy is happiness we create, but joy we're seized by. It's something that sweeps over us. And to me, the highest form of joy is not even spiritual joy, it's moral joy. And this is a joy of people, and I bet you met them, I meet them like once, pretty frequently these days, who, for them, joy is not an experience, it's an outlook. It's the way they see the world. They radiate goodness, they care about you, they don't care about themselves. They've moved, I think of this from Ptolemy to Copernicus. For Ptolemy, the universe is all revolving around us. Copernicus, we're revolving around others. And they really live a life where they've given themselves over to selfless service. And when they do that and they forget the needs and desires of the ego, they really become joyous. I was with the Dalai Lama a few months ago, or years ago now, and I was sitting next to him and he just radiated joy. He laughs for no apparent reason. Like he just bursts out laughing for no reason. And I wanted to be polite, so I started laughing, and then he laughed, and I laughed. He just radiates joy. He's a celebrity. I was up in Frederick, Maryland with some ladies who teach immigrants English and how to read. They just were patient and good and gentle, and they just radiated that joy. And it's because they're really not thinking about themselves at all. They're not asking, am I happy? They're just giving. And that is how community gets thickened. And to me, the country is now in a valley, in one of these hatchet moments where we're lost in our own self-conceptions and our hostilities and our resentments. But I have total faith in human nature to be ingenious and for people to come together. And these people, I think, are leading a cultural revolution if we would only pay attention to them and learn from them, that will lead to renegotiation of power and a re-coming together of people and a redemption of nation. One of the things I'll end on is that the country can seem so divided, but there have been other times in division where people became aware of the things that actually unite us and how these things stretch back in history for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm going to read a part of a letter that I'm sure many of you know, but I like reading it. It was written on July 14th, 1861, on the day of the first Battle of Bull Run, which is early in the Civil War, just outside of D.C. Some of you probably know this letter. It was written by a guy named Sullivan Ballou, who was an officer from Rhode Island. And he had lost his parents when he was young, and he knew what it was like to grow up in an orphanage. So he writes to his wife, Sarah, and he said, I really do not want to die in battle. And he wrote to her, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me to you with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence can break. Yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly on with all these chains to the battlefield. he felt a great indebtedness to the past. I know how strongly American civilization now leans upon the triumph of the government and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt. Now, of course, he then did die the next day in the battle. But he illustrates to us the things that we forget in moments of normalcy, that cord that brought all our ancestors here is still a binding cord that can be re-inflamed if the connections of community and heart and soul are bound together. Thank you very much. So there's time for question and answer, and so now we can talk for a Paul Manafort for an hour. And if you do have questions, I guess there's a microphone right here.
So as Professor Santuri mentioned at the beginning, if you'd please proceed up the center aisle and form a line. We'll take the questions up here. We'll have about a half an hour or so. While folks are congregating, I'll also put in a plug for the comment cards that you'll have found in your programs. We really do read all of those, and they help us inform our future programming, so we'd very much appreciate if you fill those out. There are boxes back in the entryway. And as folks make their way up, we simply ask that you keep your questions brief, since we know there are a lot of folks here that might be interested in addressing Mr. Brooks, and also keep them in the form of a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, David Brooks. I'm a big fan. When talking about the story and the stories that America has had, I'm curious on your thoughts about today and the various stories that are going on, especially with people who don't seem included in the, I guess, historical story of the United States. So marginalized groups, Native Americans, Black people, Black Lives Matter, women even. How do you get people to come together in the communities that you're talking about with these very, very deep differences in the historical stories that they were a part of? Thank you.
Yeah, I mentioned that the consensus historians, they told this story of American history, but it was the story of basically the white Protestant elite. And there's Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says back in those days, we were a guest house nation. You were sort of allowed to live here, but unless you were part of the Protestant establishment, you were reminded that it really wasn't your house. You were a guest. And you were welcome as long as you played by our rules, but not if you didn't. And so at Harvard and Yale, if your father went to Harvard and Yale in 1950, your odds of getting in were 90%. The median SAT score was 500, because it was just a bunch of families replicating themselves. And so Sachs says we can no longer be a guest house nation. People said, no, I want a voice. I want my story to be included in the story. And so he says we have to be a worker, a project nation. He says communities come together with two things. One, they have a common story, but two, they have a common task. And Sachs says in the Bible, the creation of the universe, the creation of the world in Genesis takes like 9 verses. The creation of the tabernacle in Exodus takes hundreds and hundreds of verses. They're told, like, put this cubit of that on there and then some this kind of wood and that kind of wood. Why? It's because he was forming the different Israelite tribes into a people, and a people needs to have a common project. So there has to be a home we build together, in Sax's words. And so our job right now is to hear all the stories that have gone unheard and to figure out how to weave them into one story. And I was reading somebody who said recently that, as you get more diverse, you get less social trust. And I think there's some evidence to that. But that's not a biological and physical determinative fact. That's a choice we make. And we have no choice. We are going to be a diverse nation. In 2 years, our 5-year-olds will be majority, and in 20 years, the whole country will be. So we have no choice. And so we just have to do it.
Mr. Brooks, two of the biggest themes you touched on were the idea of tribalism and your desire for community. And I know you view these things in juxtaposition, and I hope that's true. But do you ever fear that focusing on regional community as the primary source or a primary source of identity could lead to an exacerbation of tribalism, that sort of regional identity can form its own exclusatory basis of identity?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so I had this debate, one of my dear friends and colleagues on the NewsHour, I hope all of you know and remember, was Gwen Ifill. And she has a cousin who I just had this debate with, and I say, nothing is going to be solved at the national level. We have to go local. And from her perspective, she says, wait a second. I remember local. Local was segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. Local was this horrific and that horrific. And that is a completely legitimate point. My argument back to her was that in 1962, the local governments tended to be a force for injustice, and the national government was a force for justice. Today, I think it's mostly true that the local governments are forces for justice, and the national division is forces for injustice. But it's a very good point, something to be weighed as we think about rearranging power from local to national. It is the core question.
So in the question of social change, it seems to me that a lot of points in history, great voices and great leaders have led movements, Martin Luther King Jr., Karl Marx, and such. So in our culture where it seems to be there's more places like Twitter for more voices to get out there, that seems to have almost like lowered the power of the voice. So I was wondering where you think the next great leaders are going to come from.
Yeah. So this is a great question. My wife and I debate this. One of the things, when I grew up, the big social movements were masses of people led by a famous person at top. And it could be King, it could be Gloria Steinem. I grew up in the era of Reagan. He was a hero of mine, Ronald Reagan, and then all the Republicans underneath him. But now when you look at the social movements that are succeeding, there are no leaders. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the Tea Party. And so what we have is radically decentralized networks. The problem with radically decentralized networks, as Occupy Wall Street demonstrated, was they tend to spin out of control and they have no coherent voice. So the question becomes, how do you create radically decentralized movements with leaders? Or at least some cohering voice. I do think you need that cohesion. And what you see is the movements that are succeeding are mixtures of new power, which is decentralized, with old power, which is structure. I'm a big believer in institutions. I mean, I spend a lot of my time around college students who, when I grew up, I had this, World War II was like 20 years in the past. America was a force for good. The Cold War was still going on. America was a force for good. I had basic faith in America's institution because around me, when I was a little kid, I saw NASA put a man on the moon. If you're in college right now, what's your experience of American institutions? Iraq War, financial crisis, last election. Of course you have no faith in institutions, but I still have total belief that we need institutions to form us and to pour our lives into and give structure. If you don't have institutions, you don't have permanence. Nothing lasts. And so creating a structure with strong coherence but radically decentralized input, that's how the future movements are going to be built, I think.
Good evening. So I'm actually just particularly interested in your historical reflections on the shift from an individualized, or rather a collectivized culture into an individualized culture. But I think and I could be wrong here, but I think you kind of glossed over the 60s counterculture. So I'm interested to see where you believe that culture kind of came in and faded out. because I think that is probably where rock and roll came from. So,
Yeah. Right. Well, so I think that 60s counterculture, the phrase sociologists give it is expressive individualism. I want to express myself. I'm a free bird. I'm a rambling man. I'm born to run. It was about hitting the open road. Peter Fonda was in a movie, anybody? He's Easy Rider. There was a book written in 1962, very early, called Travels with Charlie by Steinbeck, I think. And it was about a guy taking his dog and hitting the open road. And the idea was that we're pinned down by too much conformity. And so I want to go out and be on my own. And I'll tell one story. My wife has heard me tell this story too much, but I enjoy it. So I grew up in Greenwich Village in the 60s. So I grew up in the heart of the counterculture. And in 1966, 65, my parents, when I was a little kid, took me to a be-in where hippies would go just to be. And it was in Central Park, and they wanted to demonstrate how much they were liberating themselves from the strictures of capitalist society. So they took their wallets, and they threw it into a garbage can, and they set it on fire. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. I broke from the crowd, I put my hand in the fire, I grabbed the money, and I ran away. And that was my first step over to the right. To me, that culture was the rising up of a young generation saying, I want to be myself, get off my back. And that was probably needed at the time. It had its excesses, but as I say, it's gone a little too far in my view.
Hi. You mentioned earlier about kind of like the polarized nature of our society, and so I was curious where you thought, or where you think William F. Buckley would fit within our political spectrum, and then how do we as Americans in a polarized society move forward?
Yeah, where I would fit or where we all fit?
I was curious where you thought William F. Buckley would fit in our
William F.
political.
Buckley, yeah, good question. So just as historical background, I was a student at Chicago, and Buckley came to campus. I wrote a parody of him for the school newspaper for being a pompous, name-dropping blowhard. It was like he wrote the first 3 volumes of his memoirs on the day of his birth, all of human history up to his conception, the seeds of utopia about his gestation, the glorious dawn about his birth. He formed 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley and one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley. And so he gave a speech to campus, I told students today earlier, and at the end of the speech he said, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. He loved it, even though it was really cruel to him. He thought it was funny, and he hired me, and I peaked at age 20. But so he was my mentor for 18 months, and he was the conservative movement. And in that movement, there were a bunch of different pieces which he fused together. There was sort of Catholic social teaching piece. There was a free market piece, Milton Friedman. There was a anti-communist piece. And people wore neckties, and you could have an Adam Smith necktie. That shows you were part of the free market camp. You could have an Aquinas necktie. You were part of the social conservative. You can have an Edmund Burke necktie. There was Tocqueville neckties. And it was all rooted in ideas. And what it had in common, my conservative influence is Edmund Burke. And Burke believed that society is really complicated and you should be really cautious about how you think you can understand it. And the phrase is epistemological modesty. Just be cautious. Change should be gradual, incremental, but constant. And so that's sort of where Buckley stood. And I began to see things beginning to change with Gingrich. In 1994, he came on and said, we're part of the Gingrich Revolution, modestly naming it after himself. And conservatives were not supposed to believe in revolutions. We had these principles. And then times went on, and I found the Republican Party grew less and less like the conservative movement I knew. And you can like it or not, but I don't think what's represented by the current Republican Party has ties to either the free market, free trade, or the sense of epistemological modesty, that the world's organic, complex. It just doesn't seem to have any continuity with the conservatism I grew up with. And I've come to accept, whether it's right or wrong, that my conservatism is never coming back, at least not for a long time. And so if you ask Republican voters, and maybe they're right, I'm not judging them, I'm just saying it's different, what's caused America's problems? The number one answer they give is too much immigration. The number two answer is too much free trade. And the number three answer they give is corruption of the elites. And so that's just a different set of issues. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, I'm not judging. I'm just saying I don't think Bill Buckley would recognize himself. And I only point out that all of those of us, and there are many of us who really grew up in the Buckley era, under Buckley, George Wills and many of the current National Review, we no longer really feel part of the party, we're homeless.
Good evening, thank you. My question is about the two mountains. Like the first mountain is like a search for the self, and the second mountain is a search for selflessness, like a pursuit of moral joy. I was wondering, how do you do the transition between the mountains? Like, is the cratering process that you were talking about in like the mid-20s, is that like, do you have to crater in order?
Yeah, I'm building a tramway across the summit. I actually do think you sort of have to crater, sorry. There was a guy named, you may have heard of him, his name is Leo Tolstoy. And he wrote all these great books, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and he went to, his brother died, and he couldn't figure out why he died and why he lived. And then he went to a decapitation in Paris, and he said, if all the intelligent people on the history of the world said a decapitation was right, I now know it's wrong, and it's always wrong. And so the two things he learned from that was we can't always trust our reason, and second, there's such a thing as eternal moral law. And this realization made all his past work as an activist and as a novelist seem useless and crazy. And so what happened, he went into a depression, he took away all the knives and all the guns and said, you gotta keep this away from me, I harm myself. And he went through this dark valley of the soul. And I sort of think that unless maybe you're a remarkable person, you have to go through that the soul has to be broken before it can pour out. Because we're naturally egotists. Now, I know some people who were broken. I mentioned Sarah Heminger, who was ostracized at 8. Happened to her at 8. Some people in their 20s, they have a rough 20s. Some people later on. Ivan Ilyich, one of Tolstoy's characters, it happened on the day of his death. But I think our ego is so strong, you have to suffer some loss or some shock or some dissatisfaction before you can wander out alone, and something has to shock you out of your egotism, in my view. And maybe it can be falling in love, maybe it can be a good thing, but often it's a rough phase. And the only thing I observe is that when you ask people, what made you who you are today, no one ever says, I had this awesome vacation in Hawaii. And it turned my whole life around. It's often some rough moment, so sorry. I hope you've had yours.
In your speech, you talked about crises. Which one concerned you the most, and which one meant the most to you?
Oh, very good question. I feel like I should ask you. Do you have a view?
Not really. I guess everything that goes on in the teenage era, that kind of concerns me a little bit, and that's about it.
Yeah. The rest of us are past that, so we're... The good question, thank you. I would say the thing concerns me the most would be, in a weird way, even though loneliness is a big one, distrust. That if you can't trust your friends, you can imagine how lonely that is. There's a guy named James Q. Wilson who wrote a book about how trust is formed, and he said it's actually formed on the playground. That when you're on the playground, a lot of what you're doing is playing games, and you're testing each other to see if your friends can trust you and you can trust them. And a lot of games on the playground is to establish, will you be kind to me? If I say something vulnerable, will you hold it and say something vulnerable to me back? And so this happens at a really, like at school. And then it keeps happening all through life. We have all these conversations. If you watch teenagers or adults out on a date, a lot of it is just, well, here's what it should be. It should be the man says something a little vulnerable, and the woman shares that back vulnerable. Then the man gets a little more vulnerable, and then the woman gets a little more vulnerable. I'm doing this heterosexually, but it's the same. And then one partner pauses, the other recognizes the pause. So it's this dance as you get to know each other better. And then you just walk through gates together, and you find you have all these things in common. Like, I don't like foie gras. I don't either. It's a miracle. We should get married. That's the ideal case. The real case is the guy is trying to impress the woman with all these stories about how he's the hero, and it doesn't work. But in theory, it is that level of trust. I think without trust, you really don't have friendship. Without friendship, it's hard to have capitalism. It's hard to have school. It's hard to have anything. Thank you for the question.
Hi, so kind of going off that last question with the idea of trusting your friends, I see a lot of people online on my Facebook feed, even some like pretty close personal friends, saying things that I just don't find morally permissible, saying that people from the other political tribe deserve to be hurt, deserve to die. And I don't know how to argue with that I don't know how to put forward a cohesive argument against that without just saying you're wrong. I don't know how to back it up.
Yeah. I think students in particular are really hard on themselves these days. Where I teach, a lot of the places I visit, and even in my own workplace with the interns, they're quick to establish moral one-upsmanship and say, I'm more woke than you, I'm better than you, whatever. And so you get a few people, we were talking about this earlier, who are constantly engaged in screaming, and then everybody else keeps their head down. And so how do you deal with fanaticism, really? Relationships can survive, I disagree with you. They can't survive, I'm better than you. And my wife and son and I were at a ball game, baseball game 2 years ago now, and I'll try to tell this story in a pulpit. And the guy in the ninth inning, the guy turns around and says to me, "Are you David Brooks?" And I say, "Yeah," and I'm hoping he'll say, "Oh, I like your work," and then we can go back to watch the game. But instead, he says, "You're an effing a-hole." And he starts screaming at me. And then my son intervenes, and he screams at him, and he says, "You should be ashamed, that guy's your father." And then my wife intervenes to the gentle feminine touch, slaps her away. In retrospect, I think the only thing you can do is, not to get religious, but it's just practical wisdom. I think the only thing you can do is love your enemies. I just don't think escalating does anything. So what I should have done, and so what I should have done is at least try and say, "Let me buy you a beer. You can say what you have to say." And one of the things that I value about this institute, frankly, it's the college campuses are turning into places where people are just scared to talk. I see this so intimately in my campus. And the good part is there's a lot of moral passion. People want to change the world. The bad part is you can't do it through hatred and bludgeoning. And so to have an institute that is essentially, let me go buy you a beer and let's talk, seems like a banal thing, but it's actually a very brave and important thing. And that is really the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you for the lovely way you've shared your mind and your heart with us tonight. This is a beloved community. It is very thick. And in the spring of 2017, there were student protests against racism that were revelatory, very profound. I came down to participate from Minneapolis, where I live, and never have experienced as much joy at St. Olaf as I did during that time because of the community forged by those people who have been on the margins and who are speaking their truth. And I think a thick community can sometimes, out of defensiveness, solidify. And I think in response, St. Olaf has stepped forward to embrace the differences and the criticisms that were brought forward about institutional racism, but in some ways has solidified in not wanting to deal with it out of defensiveness. How would you suggest an institution like St. Olaf find its unity?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me patience is racism is the core sin of our society. And it's got a 400-year history. And so it's going to take a little while. We should be patient and merciful with each other. I do think two things have to happen, and I'll go back to Rabbi Sachs. First, the stories have to finally get out. And frankly, the last 3 or 4 years since Ferguson's, since Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote his book, have been to me a useful and necessary era of unveiling and storytelling. Sometimes with anger, and I've seen a lot of it in my friends. And I think that's necessary, but I think two other things have to happen. One is as I say, I think communities aren't only built with stories, they're built with projects. And so I think it's insufficient to say, let's just have a conversation about race, but that's necessary, but insufficient. I think we also have to build something together. And so if we talk to each other about race all the time, we'll be stuck in a conversation. But communities are filled by building something together. And that's why I think this project of building community, reweaving the fabric of local relationships, building social mobility, those projects are things that keep us together. What do communities organize around? They tend to organize around their kids. They sometimes organize around the arts. They sometimes organize around efforts at moral uplift. So to me, a friendship is not, as C.S. Lewis said, a friendship is not face-to-face. It's two people looking in the same direction at once. And we have not yet moved to that point where people across diversity are looking at the same project at once and working side by side. And that way, we're doing the same thing together. We don't have to assimilate into each other. We can keep our distinct identities, but we've got a common goal and a common sense of movement. And what I like about the community village, and I'll be blunt, I travel around the country with this Aspen Institute project that's called Weave. And in the daytime, we meet community builders and we talk about what they're doing. And the organizations are often very diverse. And they're building a project, say, like Sarah Heminger with Thread, or we have a friend named Mac McCarter in Shreveport. There are 200,000 people in Shreveport. 50,000 of them are volunteers in his organization to help the young, to help the poor, to create communities. And they're very integrated. And they're happy and they're making progress and working together. But then when you step back and have the argument about systems, which is what we do in the nighttime with groups of people, you get anger at injustice and oppression. And both those realities are true. But to me, the hopeful reality is the one of working together for a third thing, not just talking to each other about the past. And so to me, it's about finding common projects.
Time for about 2 more quick questions.
So I think your focus on community is an absolutely extraordinary take on the American political system, and certainly the political system within Minnesota. I know in my town of Rochester, there's been a lot more focus on community, and it's led to a lot of opportunities for young people like me and some of my friends. But my question for you is more of one on the national level, particularly relating to community. In the upcoming 2020 elections, do you think there's a real opportunity we could see a presidential candidate running on a platform of community involvement and trying to build up things on the local level, or is just that not really a possibility if you want to be elected president?
Yeah. First, the one thing I want to emphasize is that the community is the unit of change. Sometimes we think the individual is the unit of change. If we just, the starfish story, I threw that one back in, I saved that one. But as a friend of mine says, you can't just clean out the part of the swimming pool you're swimming in. You got to clean the whole pool. And so to me, you ask people, what's your primary identity? It might be St. Olaf. It might be Wilkes-Barre, North Carolina. It could be my community, my neighborhood in wherever, St. Paul. And that's the unit of change. It tends to be the neighborhood or the local town. Now, I personally believe that national reconciliation is downstream from that. That as long as social trust is so bad at the local level, it's very hard to impose that on the top down, because retrust involves, as I say, intimate relationship. Now, when I give political advice, I won't say what he said on his side of the conversation, but I was giving political advice to Michael Bloomberg. And I say that because it's very important that a 5'6" guy from New York become president of the United States. And I said, if you think you can run for president as a centrist candidate or as a moderate, you're wrong. There are not enough centrists anymore in this country to support a third party. I would love it if that were true, that's where I am, but it's just not true. So if you're going to run as a non-orthodox Republican or Democrat, you have to be the most radical candidate in the race, but radical down, radical to localism, and say we'll devolve powers and we'll give real power to communities. And we're going to shake up the configuration of power in this country. And I will say my advice was not heeded, but I think, I would love to see it happen in 2020. When I look at history, like the progressive era I talked about, you've got to have a lot of community change first before the civic change or the political change can happen. So my own prognosis is that we're in for a rough period of polarization for the next 10 years or so. The printing press was invented. There was a moral structure, to go back to earlier moral ecologies, of traditional authority where everybody in the community had the same morality and they all looked up to the same leader. And that was disrupted by the rise of the printing press. And people thought, oh, the printing press is wonderful. We'll all get to talk to each other and we'll have peace. So instead we had 300 years of a religious war. And so when you get these transitions, it tends to be bumpy. When you disequilibrate a system, it keeps going. And if you look at politics this last week, what you see is a system getting bumpier. So that's why I think bottom up.
Hi, my politics are very different from yours, but you're somebody that I read fairly regularly because the issue of polarization has gotten so extreme and seems so dangerous at this particular moment. But I think that one of the resources that was available in the past to people who wanted to build some kind of moral community inclusion common project were religious symbols and institutions. And I think it had started well before, but really got off the ground in my generation, that people perceived religion and religious stories and institutions as being fraught not just with the particularity of the religions themselves, but also with a kind of political particularity, belonging essentially to a single party that many people opposed. So if that is the context and the history between, say, the 1990s and now, according to Putnam and Campbell, what recommendations could you conceive of to use religious symbols in the curriculum, in a university, in a college, to build a kind of moral community rather than take people further apart from one another?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I hesitate to diss religion in this space because lightning bolts will come down. I'll say a couple things that I think are necessary. First, I really think it's hard to measure how you're doing. This was a point from my last book, how to measure how you're doing personally on how your moral progress is without certain words like redemption, grace, sin. I think if you don't understand that words, it's really hard to understand what's happening to yourself. And they don't always have to be explicitly religious words. Like sometimes when you're ill or you have a tragedy in your family, there are people who disappear from your life. You're best friends, but they don't show up. But then there are people you barely know who show up for you big time. And they give you undeserved love. And that's grace. So we can all feel what grace is. And if you don't have the categories in your head, I think it's hard to think that way. Before I wrote the book, I was on a show, and I mentioned that what the book was, and I got a letter from another editor, and he said, I love the way you talked about your book, but I wouldn't use that word sin. It's such a downer. Use the word insensitive. And I said, no, that's why I'm writing the book. In my view, and this is my sense of personal vocation, in my view, American politics or American conversation is over-politicized and under-moralized. We talk too much about every little poll and every little scandal, and not enough about how we relate to one another, not enough what the good life looks like, not enough, about our sense of vocation and commitment. And so my job, as I have assigned it to myself, is to do what I can to shift the conversation a little over. And then the second thing I'll say about religion, and I understand how hard this is, because a lot of people feel shut out by religions because of their sexuality or because of their opinions. But to me, social progress will be made in this country when secular progressives get in touch with Orthodox religious people because they have one thing in common, and that is the belief that the marginalized and how we treat the marginalized and the poor is the defining definition of our society. And that's what Jesus said, and that's what Maimonides said, and that's what Muslims say, and that's what liberals say. I'm trying to think of a good counterpart. Okay, Elizabeth Warren. And so we've had a massive culture war over the sexual revolution. And I'm in favor, people are going to have their different views, and I don't want to disrespect them. I'm in favor of a truce, or just let's put that aside and work on what we have in common, which is really a belief that the poor are closer to God or closer to virtue than the rest of us, which is what every religion I know believes. And so I'll just end. I don't know how many of you saw this movie about Fred Rogers. Highly recommend it. And right now I'm looking at my Twitter feed this week, and I don't really have position on this, but it's going crazy with bad arguments. But it is worth reminding ourselves that there are way more Fred Rogerses in the world. Most people I know are really, maybe not as good as him, but good. And most people I know in politics on Capitol Hill hate the way things are now. So somehow, the goodness somehow has to be unleashed. And I want to thank you for coming out, because if it can't be unleashed in a nice place like Minnesota, I think you guys have to lead the way. Thank you.